I have a song that I'm very proud of called The Ballad of Sally Ann. With love in his heart and flowers in his hand, Johnny proposed to Sally Ann. Sally shivered as she said, I'll love you to the day you're dead. Then it fast forward, the ride to the church bore strange fruit. As he hung from the tree, you could hear her cry. Who's gonna dance with Sally Ann? So this whole point is, one, I wanted to narrate actual lynching in a country song. All these country songs in the South set in small towns, they have erased the lynchings. I have put it back in, and it certainly stands as witness. I wanted to witness in this community.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Historically Speaking program on Alice Randall's book, My Black Country. My name is Stephen Lewis. I'm the Curator of Music and Performing Arts, and I'm going to introduce our panelists. Kelly Navies is the museum specialist in oral history at the, oh, hold on, just a moment. I should also say the clip that you've just seen is a clip from an oral history that Alice Randall recorded with Kelly Navies, our museum specialist in oral history, and Trudy Hutcherson. And so that oral history is now part of our permanent collection here at the museum, and we are very honored to have added it to our permanent collection. Now then, introduce our panelists. Kelly Navies is the museum specialist in oral history at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Navies' oral history projects are located at the Southern Oral History Program, the Reginald F. Lewis Maryland Museum of African American History and Culture, the Washington, D.C. Public Library People's Archive, and at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Cultural Oral History Program. Her writing may be found in several publications, including Musical Crossroads, Stories Behind the Objects of African American Music by Dwandalyn Reese, and the upcoming Afrolacha, Testimonies, with photographer Chris Aluka Berry. Finally, Navies, originally from the California Bay Area, has resided in Washington, D.C. for 20 years. Alice Randall is a New York Times best-selling novelist, award-winning songwriter, educator, food activist, and now memoirist. A graduate of Harvard University, she holds an honorary doctorate from Fisk University, is on the faculty at Vanderbilt University, and credits Detroit's Ziggy Johnson School of the Theater with being the most influential educational institution in her life. She is widely recognized as being one of the most significant voices in 21st century African American fiction, the only black woman in history to write both a #1 country song, X's and O's, and an ACM Video of the Year, Is There Life Out There, starring Reba McEntire. My Black Country, which we'll be discussing tonight, memoir and an album, is a summit of a storied career. Randall's work has been or is currently being taught at a wide range of universities, including Fisk, Harvard, Iowa State, Penn State, Philander Smith, Princeton, Tuskegee, the University of Texas, Austin, the University of Virginia, and Wesleyan. Please join me in welcoming Kelly Navies and Alice Randall.
How's everybody doing? Can you hear me? Great, okay. Well, I am really excited to be here this evening with my colleagues, Stephen Lewis and Alice Randall. I've been looking forward to this discussion for a while. Let's talk about Black country. Alice, I want you to discuss and tell us, how did a Black girl born in Detroit become so passionate about country music? Tell me about your early years in Detroit and the first country song that you wrote.
Kelly, Elaine, first of all, I want to thank you for all the work you're doing with oral history. And you've worked with some of my favorite people, Jessica B. Harris, and I'm thrilled to be part of that group. And
Stephen, I thank you for the work you did at the National Museum of African American Music in Nashville, and now you've risen to this, my favorite institution, the Smithsonian. So thank you for both of you
for making a space for me in my Black country.
It's my honor.
I was born in 1959 in the same year and place as Motown Records. And I think that had a lot to do with how I got to Music City. I was born in a riverside music town and I moved to another. But my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt, Mary Frances, only had one thing in common. And it wasn't the Pistons or gardening or loving me. My mother did not love me. It was country music. My grandmother loved the songs in air. She would sing to me, "Will the Circle Be Unbroken?" My aunt loved Mr. Ray Charles. She wore out playing modern sounds in country and Western music for me. And my mother would sneakily listen to the radio honky-tonk hits in the basement when she did the laundry and also in the car. So I heard country music in my childhood. Now, you have to remember, in 1959, this was not uncommon. Ray Charles said that his mama would let him stay up late on Saturday nights to listen to the Opry. If you were a Black person living in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia in the 30s and 40s, there was no Black radio to listen to. You could hear Black music in juke joints, live in churches, in homes. But what you heard on the radio was country music, and Black people knew it well. And as you'll hear over the course of this time, one of the things I was told, so I told you about my mother, my aunt, and my grandmother. There's another really important figure in this. It's my daddy. And my daddy was a girl dad and a feminist girl dad before people called them either of those things. He's the person who pointed out to me that Anna Records was founded a year before Motown Records by Berry Gordy's sister, Anna. He's also the person who told me the banjo was an African instrument, that country was a treasure trove of hidden Black genius, and probably most significantly for me, that Lil Hardin Armstrong, played on what he called, quote unquote, and trigger warning for anyone who this triggers, that big Peckerwood hit, or otherwise known as Blue Yodel No. 9, the first million-selling country record. My father told me from early days was starred a Black woman, Lil Hardin, playing the piano. So I was marinated in country from my earliest days.
I see. And you also managed to write your very first country song when you were very young.
I did. Before I entered kindergarten, that daddy of mine that told me that Lil Hardin played on the big song, the first million-selling country record, he was a very imperfect and wonderful man. And he often would stop me in the car, leave me alone in the car, and dash inside a door. I didn't know what he did inside that door, but he would often leave me in the car, and he'd say, "I'll be back before the hands on the clock get to this point in the car clock." And he always was back before the hands got there. He was very reliable. But one day, darkness was falling, it was a little bit cold, and I did not want to be alone in the car. And I said to him, I looked at the letters hanging in the sky, and I said, "Daddy, don't go in that BAR." And he said, "I have parked you in front of too many bars if you're reading those letters out to me." And he did go in the bar, but he took me with him. And he sat me on a bar stool. And I turned that into fiction in my Black Bottom Saints. It tells the whole story of the cocktail that was made for me, the mocktail that was made for me. You can read that in Black Bottom Saints. But what happened in real life, aside, I did get the mocktail. My Aunt Mary Frances in her house, she had a whole side yard. And this also tells you what Detroit was like in the early 60s. There was yard on all four sides of the house. And on one side, there were 5 fruit trees. And my favorite fruit tree to sit up in and climb was the cherry tree. And my Aunt Mary Frances told me that the birds have poo-pooed on the cherries. So they would give me a jar of maraschino bar cherries to take up in the cherry tree. And I would nibble on those cherries and sing songs originally my grandmother had taught me to the birds. But eventually, I started making up my own songs to the birds when I was about 3, 4 years old. And the first one I remember making up was, "Daddy, don't go in that BAR. Please don't leave me alone in the car. Something on a something star. Daddy, don't go in that BAR." And that's, for for me, the history of writing country, that something too hard to bear gets transformed into something beautiful that makes the hard bearable. And that song I took with me to Nashville. It kept on evolving. When I arrived in 1983, and a man called Archie Jordan, who's written some huge country hits, What a Difference You Made in My Life, he looked at a lot of things I had written, and he picked this one. He said, this is a hit. I said, that happened to me. He said, I know. I was thinking, how could you know? He said, you couldn't invent that. But we never got rid of it because I could not alter that. That one belonged to me and my daddy, the cherry tree and the birds. But I wrote my first country song sitting in a Motown cherry tree.
I love that. I love that story. So a little thing we have in common is that I was actually born in Detroit. My family didn't stay there long, but I was immersed in African-American culture, I thought, but I've learned so much reading your book about Black country that I didn't know before. And I'm wondering if you and Stephen, if we can discuss this project of expanding the canon of African-American music so that people include Black country. How do we do that? What artifacts do we have here in the museum?
Sure. Right. So I can say, and first of all, I learned a lot reading the book too. And you know, we have, I'd say in our collection, you know, most or all of the, like, you know, the first family of Black country that you talk about in the book are represented in our museum collection. We have a poster from Harlem on the Prairie, starring Herb Jeffries. We've got one of DeFord Bailey's harmonicas. We've got, of course, actually the most interesting, we've got a few different Ray Charles things. One that is particularly relevant is a letter that Jimmy Davis wrote to Ray Charles when he was governor of Louisiana about Ray Charles's version of You Are My Sunshine. And so in a lot of ways, that letter kind of like materializes, you know, that, you know, a lot of the elements of the, you know, the connections between R&B and country music and the blues, you know, talking about the Black presence in all of those musical traditions. We also have an interesting artifact from when Lil Hardin was playing with King Oliver. So in 1924, Lil, as a member of King Oliver's band, played at the University of Illinois Senior Ball. And so we have a dance card that a student who attended the ball had, and it has, you know, King Oliver's band kind of featured prominently on the front of it. And I'm trying to think of, let's see, have I hit all the first family members?
What do you have from Mr. Charley Pride?
Of course. Well, we have Mr. Charley Pride's, thank you. We have Charley Pride's award for Male Vocalist of the Year from CMA. We also have a couple of suits that he donated to us as well. So, you know, so we have those figures represented, but then we also have other things that are very much part of the story, you know, maybe from musicians whose names we don't even know. I'm thinking about things like, you know, we have fiddles and banjos from the mid-19th century that are really kind of, you know, the Black fiddle and banjo tradition, which is descended from like the West African fiddle and lute tradition, is also like at the root of country music in America. And, you know, it's pretty well documented in our permanent collection as well, via instruments and then also via other types of printed material. And so, you know, between all those things, I think we have the beginnings of a collection that can really document and celebrate the Black presence in the music. Obviously, it's only the start. So we're hoping to, you know, as these stories are getting told, as audiences are learning about this history for the first time, we want to be able to present that history to the public because we're very fortunate to have such a big platform here.
Thank you. Did you want to add?
I want to say two things. But one, the first time I met Mr. Charley Pride, I was walking, it was at an ASCAP dinner, and I was making my way to him, and the governor stopped me. And I knew that he had written You Are My Sunshine, and but I was on my way to Charley Pride, and one of the things I loved about Charley Pride is, as I approached his table, and I talk about this in the book, he stood up, and I don't know, it was because I was the only Black woman in the room that wasn't serving at table. It certainly had a lot to do with the fact he knew it was hard to be in that room. And also he just had great home training, or perhaps he just had to go to the bathroom. But he did stand up and he greeted me, and we had a relationship from that first year till the year he died, when he came to watched the documentary, the last documentary made about his life. We were in a theater sort of like this, and there were two VIP sections. There was a lesser VIP section, which I was in, and there was a higher VIP section where Tanya Tucker was and where he was supposed to sit. And he came into the room, and he saw me sitting in the lesser VIP section, and he sat right beside me to watch his movie. And when I came on the screen, he pointed to me. He was so generous and made a way for other people. But what he would want me to tell you is that it's not just expanding the canon, it's acknowledging the canon. That country music is intrinsically black. Not everything is, but country music is. That if the definition, the working definition of country music I have, that I think most scholars who are really familiar with the field now, something akin to this. It's Celtic, English, Irish, and Scottish ballad forms, plus African influences, plus evangelical Christianity. It takes all three of those things for something to be country. And the black influences can be black gospel music, it can be instruments such as the banjo or the fiddle, it can be an African sense of spirituality appearing in sacred space and nature. But without the African influences, you likely have some kind of folk music, American folk music. Without the evangelical Christianity, you may have blues music. To be country, you're going to see all three of these things. And so all country music, acknowledged or unacknowledged, is black country music.
So you talk about this, and you guys are getting a little taste of what's in this wonderful book. We've also mentioned several names that you may not recognize, such as Lil Hardin. So let's talk about the book, My Black Country. First of all, this the meanings associated with the title, and then I want you to talk about Lil Hardin and this first family of black country that you define in your book.
Well, first, My Black Country is the physical country music we just discussed. It is also America, and it is also the physical continent. That it's acknowledging that the continent, that the West, it's not just the South. I was just thinking as I moved, coming tonight, I was thinking about a wonderful song written in Omaha, Nebraska. Straighten up and fly right. Tell them who wrote that.
Nat King Cole.
People don't write, Nat King Cole wrote that and he didn't know I was going to ask him that question, in Omaha, Nebraska. And what's wild about it is he was drawing on the tradition of black barnstormers, of actual airplanes that have come out of the agrarian movement, that are coming out of working in farms, and that they are getting this opportunity. A lot of the Tuskegee Airmen originally were Nebraska farm boys. People don't notice that. That's My Black Country. It's the rest of this Western story.
Yes.
It's the Southern, so it's all of those things. Now, the first family of black country, because I'm also, I'm a school teacher, I'm a professor at Vanderbilt, I'm the mother of a professor at Vanderbilt who's taught at more universities than me. I give you this cheat sheet, because it's a lot, because the history begins in the 17th century. We even have, by the 18th century, that wonderful painting, the old plantation, that actually doesn't depict a plantation. Plantation is tiny in the background. What's in the foreground is a group of black people, one of whom is playing the banjo, and they are in their own community experience, engaged with banjo music. We have the tanner that in the 19th century, the banjo lesson, elderly black person teaching a young person. So this is a long history, but if you only remember 5 names of it, the recorded part of country music. DeFord Bailey, in 1927, right after the words Grand Ole Opry are spoken on the radio for the first time, the next sound you will hear is DeFord Bailey playing Pan-American Blues. He was the Opry's first superstar. He helped launch the careers of both Chet Atkins and so many others. 1930, Lil Hardin will play in Los Angeles on what many people consider, Johnny Cash, for example, the most iconic country song of all time, Blue Yodel #9. It is also the first million-selling country song. And Lil is going to play the piano in every part of it, probably brought this song to the section and likely elaborated on its writing. It was a traditional song. As my father used to say to me, what you bet traditional was a colored gal? So I say that Ray Charles is DeFord and Lil's genius child, and he will come out in 1962-3 with Modern Sounds in Country and Western. But before that, we'll have Lil's stepson, metaphorically, Herb Jeffries. Herbie Hancock, at one point Herb Jeffries was so famous, Herbie Hancock's parents named him for Herb Jeffries. But in the 30s and 40s, he will create bronze buckaroo movies. These are singing cowboy pictures that are for a black audience. They will be filmed on an all-black dude ranch just north of Los Angeles, and they will be extremely influential. He'll be as the bronze buckaroo. And then we've got DeFord's side child. I've already mentioned him, Charley Pride. I call him country as cornbread, Charley Pride. He will be the first black entertainer of the year. That was 1971. When I arrived in Nashville in 1983, Charley Pride had already been 29 times to the #1 spot in country music. I will say something I was in Tulsa and Kansas City last week, and I met a gentleman come from a prominent family in one of the, I'm not going to even say which city right now, one of those cities. And he said the first black person that his father did not refer to in the N-word was Mr. Charley Pride. That when he came and heard him sing, that he had so much respect for Charley Pride, he had to find new language for him, which gives you just some sense of the impact way beyond music that Charley Pride had. He was Entertainer of the Year in 1971. As I said, he would get to 30 #1 songs. So that's the first family. DeFord Bailey, Lil Hardin Armstrong, Ray Charles, their genius child, Herb Jeffries, Lil's stepchild. She and Louis Armstrong will actually discover him in Detroit, tell them about their work in country and Western music, and send him to doing those bronze buckaroo movies. And DeFord's side child, Charley Pride. DeFord Bailey will be the first black person on the Opry to be a member, and Charley Pride will be the second.
If you learned something new, raise your hand. Amazing, right? So you also have this chapter that I love where you talk about a train ride that you took with your family to go west and mirror the path of Lil Hardin. Tell us a little bit more about that, and also about what you find out west and the cultural significance of black cowboys.
Well, I've been 41 years in country and Western music, and that career is almost exactly divided in half by a trip I took with across the country, following in the path of Lil Hardin. At the time my mother was dying, I was trying to get closer and closer. Lil interiorly was like the mama of my imagination. She was a songwriter. I wanted to be a songwriter. And my best friend Mimi, who's in the audience, gifted me that trip as a present that year, that summer. And I took my daughter, my then husband, and my daughter's best friend, and we set out on the path of following Lil Hardin. So that meant we flew up to Chicago. She didn't get to fly. We started in Chicago at the very same train station she had gone to, and we took the train west to San Francisco, as she had taken the train in 1921 with King Oliver for the first time. This is before Louis had even joined, and there's a stunning photograph of her in this little gingham dress, and she, at that time, less than 20% of black families had telephones. It was very different. When she had almost no idea what the Pacific Ocean would look like, what she was going to, but she got on a train in Chicago, headed for San Francisco and the Barbary Coast, and she would make amazing music there. And we followed that path. And then we went down the coast of California to Los Angeles, which I consider the capital of black country. Have to read all about that, but let's just say Lil Hardin actually sang, recorded Blue Yodel #9 there. Ray Charles recorded a lot of modern sounds in country and Western. Lionel Richie, who's written for Kenny Rogers and so many big country artists, actually wrote there. The Dude Ranch, where Herb Jeffries was filming, is outside of Los Angeles. Arizona Drains in 1911 will be the black woman piano player who will create the kind of music Ray Charles will play and Jerry Lee Lewis will play, the way they style the piano. So we went to Los Angeles, but then we get back on a train that should be renamed because it's called the Southwest Chief. And we are going through, we are encountering the black cowboys, black and brown cowboys. And what I wanted to just say about that is the very first collection of cowboy songs is something that came out about 1904, Thorpe. The first cowboy camp Thorpe came to was a black cowboy camp. The Smithsonian has actually done some work on this. 20 to 30% of all cowboys were black and brown, and a certain percentage of them were Spanish-speaking black and brown cowboys. And the most important one of them for me is Nat Love, who many of you know. He became a Pullman porter, and a lot of Pullman porters had been formerly cowboys. You can read more about that in My Black Country, but you can also read Nat Love's book. It's in the public domain and in Project Gutenberg.
Thank you. So I want to bring you into this conversation, Stephen. This moment that we're in right now. When I first interviewed you about a year ago, it was before Cowboy Carter hit Beyonce's album. And now, a year later, it's a different musical landscape. Can both of you speak to that and what that means?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I spent a lot of time thinking about Cowboy Carter in light of having worked in black music history in Nashville at a time when, I feel like around 2020, so like around the time when people were really starting to devote more kind of space in popular culture and public discourse to talking about the unacknowledged, presence of black people in various arenas of life and, unacknowledged aspects of American history. There was sort of a reckoning that was beginning to happen, at least as I could see it, in the community in Nashville talking about country music as well. And being at the Museum of African American Music at that time, we were participating in that more than anything, probably like learning from the people who had been around, working as black people in the industry for much longer than we had been there. But I feel like with Cowboy Carter coming out, a lot of the work that like people like Alice have been doing for a long time, all these African American country artists and Americana artists in Nashville, like Rhiannon Giddens and Allison Russell and all those other people, like it felt like that was kind of finally bubbling up to the surface of people who maybe were not like hip to everything that was happening in Nashville for a while. Because it was really an incredible experience being there at that time and meeting the people and talking to the people I got to talk to. So so I think about that quite a bit now because I think it's kind of surfaced in the broader popular conversation because Beyonce also saw this happening and made her statement, and and she had done daddy lessons and she had a country influence in her music before, but to do an album length kind of examination of country music, I think is part of that story that's been going on for a much longer time. So that's my thought anyway.
Mm-hmm. I think she's Ray Charles's genius daughter that eclipses the father. No, I would just say that I do think that Beyonce moment, and I completely agree with Stephen that this is something that really began about 2006 when we had Reese Palmer landing on the charts, the first black woman to be on the charts since Linda Martell 40 years before. Linda Martell is on the Beyonce album, but Reese gets on in about 2006. Around that same time, Rhiannon Giddens, as part of the Carolina Chocolate Drops, was in the Great Debaters. So I think 2006 was also the year I started teaching country lyric and American culture, and that was as country as an Afro-Celtic form. And I think that this is flowering that she started a global discussion on.
Well, that leads us to the album. Your book comes with an album of your songs and all black women artists, including some of the women that you just mentioned, Reese Palmer and Rhiannon Giddens. Talk about that and talk about women in music and the history of that.
Remember, and it's that when I got to Nashville in '83, Charley Pride had been at the top of the charts 29 times, we'll get there 30 times next. Until this year, no black woman has been at the top of the charts, period, not one. I can't even name you all the black men have been there. It's not just Charley Pride. There's been so many, I don't know all their names. Darius Rucker is one. I'm not going to go on with the names. So I thought I actually would retire. I turned 65 this year, or die before this happened. I'm so thrilled. But I think that it is very significant that there have been these extraordinary voices. And say a Rhiannon Giddens, who is, classically trained opera singer, no matter by a Pulitzer Prize winning writer who is an extraordinary songwriter, physically beautiful, and she's a virtuoso, multiple instrumentalist. And she could not get anywhere on the country charts. This was examples, it's beyond the scope of this talk, of cultural redlining and actual obstacles. Reese Palmer, the same thing. But now, 0 and 1 are very different numbers. Now that people realize it can be done, that Beyonce has done it from the outside, she won't be the last. But it is a very, but what I love is, though they weren't getting on the charts, Allison Russell was adding a song, I talked about it, for the country canon. Persephone is one of the 10 greatest country songs of all time.
Wonderful.
Allison Russell is on the album. Rhiannon Giddens is on the album. Miko Marks, Reese Palmer, Valerie June, all these women who have been making amazing music came together with Ebony Smith. I don't know how many of you have seen Hamilton. She was the engineer in Hamilton. She produced this album. She's a black woman out of Memphis, Tennessee. And I was thrilled when Glenn Campbell and Trisha Yearwood and Mo Bandy and all these very interesting artists recorded my songs initially in the 80s, 90s. Everything on the album had been recorded. Many of the things have been hits. But all the voices up until this time have been white voices. And it wasn't that I didn't want white voices. It was that I didn't want no black voices. And I had never had one black woman record one of my songs up until now. It was that it was never a black woman that I wanted to change. I didn't want to make it only black women, but I did not want it to be never a black woman.
Thank you. Let's talk about some of those lyrics, because you have some subversive lyrics that are empowering for women.
Small towns are smaller for girls. That was one of the songs. That was a Holly Dunn. I don't know how many of you are old enough to know who Mary Tyler Moore is, but she actually had a country radio, a record label. And it had definitely a feminist bent. Two of the big songs I had were on her label. One was Small Towns Are Smaller for Girls. The other was Girls Ride Horses Too, which was a top 10 song. And that was about women getting caught up in the drug trade and being intimidated and sexually harassed by their partners into being caught up in the drug trade. And that was a song released in country in the 80s. This country has always tackled hard subjects. Many Mansions, as far as we know, the first song on country radio that charted in the top 40 about homelessness. I wrote that living in New York around the time my daughter, in 1987, when she was born, and we were living in Chelsea. The Ballad of Sally Ann that Rhiannon Giddens recorded is about a lynching. That's that song that you heard me talk about in there, at the beginning. So the Reese Palmer song that Glenn Campbell did. Glenn Campbell is one of my favorite country artists, and he wrote Galveston, which is one of the great anti-war songs of all time. And the day he recorded Who's Minding the Garden, he told me, this is Galveston big. He understood that environmentalism was a big problem facing the planet, the world right then. And it's a song about environmental racism and just environment and global warming and different problems, environmental destruction. And Glenn Campbell did record that song and loved that song, but Reese Palmer is a very important voice to that, because so many black people think that they don't have time for environmental issues. And black kids are dying disproportionately of asthma related to environmental problems. And so when Reese Palmer puts that out there, I think it's changing the conversation, opening up the conversation to black echo grief and subjects that we haven't had.
That's right. And tell us the story about Aretha Franklin and how she ended up in one of your songs as well.
Oh, the shortest version of that is my daughter on the album, X's and O's, was written about something that happened to me, but you have to read the story to know that. But the important part of that was, it has a line in it, she's got her God and she's got good wine, Aretha Franklin and Patsy Cline. And I got to meet Aretha Franklin, and she said she loved that. She said, how does it feel to write a country classic? I got to meet her at the Ryman when she was singing there. On the album, Caroline deconstructs that song and writes an homage to it. But what was really important to me about X's and O's, which was 2 weeks at #1, and is 30 years later this summer, is a reoccurrent country classic. I mean, it's one of the most streamed country old songs, is that it's about women keeping up the balance between love and money. It's about economic anxiety. These are issues that are very important to women to this day. But it's also about, it's not just songwriters who are writers and important. That people who are just signing their letters with X's and O's, who are writing letters to their family, are important too. And that's what I love about country and black country. It works both ends of the street. It believes life is hard, God is real. The road and family and liquor are compensations, and the past is better than the present. And sometimes that past that's better than the present is a moment in childhood where you are protected or you are innocent enough to sign your letters with X's and O's. And all that's celebrated in X's and O's. It's about money anxiety and about the everyday writing of everyday people. Texting is literature too. And that, because country has its roots in the underclass, it understands the everyday art of living. In fact, that will be my last word. Them, Brown Gal was one of Lil Hardin's biggest songs. And I think about John Henry and Polly Ann working on the railroad, which is part of why I like that trip. John Henry and Polly Ann worked themselves to death. Lil arted herself into life. And that is as black country as it gets. And that is black country for everybody. Art yourself to life.
So I have to ask you a little bit more about California, as a California girl. You mentioned Los Angeles being the capital of black country. You also mentioned Oakland in your book a little bit, so.
The Pointer Sisters, and aren't you from that area?
Yes.
In 1974, they had the song that was country vocal dual event of the year, Grammy. They won the Grammy in 1974. An amazing song that not only did they record, they wrote, called Fairy Tale. You don't love me, it's plain to see. It became my theme song for the music industry's attitude towards me. You don't love me, it's plain to see. But Elvis Presley even recorded that song. So many people have recorded that song. But this cultural redlining, when I looked at 1974 on the Grammys, they do the highlights on their website. At the time I finished my book, they don't even mention the Pointer Sisters winning Grammy for vocal duo or group of the year in '74. They erased from the history. I hope they change that when they read that in the book. But I do love the Pointer Sisters, and I think that they are extremely important part of the Bay Area, California.
Thank you. You have to shout out the Bay Area. People forget about the Pointer Sisters. I was just thinking about Car Wash the other day, and people haven't seen the film. If you haven't seen it, they're in it. Yeah. So I want to thank you for writing this book, because one of the really important themes that runs through it is this idea of bringing things to the light. I feel like you're helping people like me sort of come out of the closet as country music lovers, because I've been listening to the Pointer Sisters, Lionel Richie, Bill Withers, all these people, and not associating it with country. So if you could both talk a little bit about that idea of bringing things to the light that are hidden. I never knew you had written the song for the film, The Thing Called Love. You wouldn't know that a black woman was a writer in this film. I mean, there's so many instances of that kind of thing, and so it's wonderful that you brought this out to tell this story.
Sure. I mean, so I can give a little bit of, I guess, background to, why it's so important to, to bring these stories to the light, and maybe the issue of, you're talking about cultural redlining, the whole reason, or one of the reasons why African Americans have been written out of the history of country music, or kind of the canon of country music or whatever, has to do with the way that genres are constructed, So when you have, and I'm gonna kind of put all the blame on Ralph Peer, but it's really like a bigger story than just Ralph Peer. So he's a record producer in the 1920s. In 1923, he records Mamie Smith, the first blues record. And that creates what becomes known as the race records market, right? So these are records that are marketed towards African American audiences of, blues, of jazz, and then also of like sermons and religious singing as well. And in 1927, he goes to Bristol, Virginia, and is responsible for what is now known as the Big Bang of country music. So this is recordings of traditional musicians from mainly Appalachia, but people also came from elsewhere. And this is kind of seen as the start of country music as a distinct category of recorded music. You know, obviously the history goes back further than that, but this is the first time it is recorded and marketed on a large scale. Now, his innovation there, which was both very commercially successful, but also probably culturally pernicious, well, certainly, you know, in light of what we're talking about, is, you know, to make a division between race records, which had already, you know, come into existence a few years before, and what became known initially as hillbilly records, and eventually that becomes known as country music. So race records are being marketed and sold to black consumers. Hillbilly records are being marketed and sold to white consumers. Along with that kind of segmentation of the market, you also have, on hillbilly records, you have white artists, or if you have an interracial group, you don't say that that's what it is. So there are some mixed race groups that record hillbilly music where it's only recently come out that there were black musicians playing. So in effect, what happens is where you had you know, many black string band musicians who played for white and black audiences, you have this long tradition of African-American string band music and African-American country music. Most of that does not actually come through in the recorded legacy of the music. And then over the years, you know, that marketing in a racialized way kind of like is almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like you have this idea kind of grow in culture that country music is white people's music, you know, where blues is black people's music and country music is white people's music. And so, you know, that leads to, again, black country artists have this uphill battle, right, to be recognized as participants in this music, members of this community, people who are just as much in the tradition as white country artists are.
I love that you bring up the Big Bang.
Yeah.
Because the two big artists that came out of that were Jimmy Rogers, who I've just told you that the power behind him was this black woman, Lil Hardin, and the other one is the Carter family. And if you read in my book, you'll see that Esley Riddle taught them so much of both their repertory and actually, you know, this thing they call Mother Maple Carter family scratch. Well, Esley Riddle had lost two of his fingers. It's a three-finger picking style. He had lost two of his fingers in a gun accident. And he is the one who's teaching them their songs in the first place. And he was already playing with three fingers. We have documented this. So Carter finger scratch is something they invent, or is it the man who was missing the two fingers who have been long playing? And they acknowledge, they play with him on the stage. So these two big artists, the mama and papa of country music, are considered to be the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers. Well, they both are completely integrated with black artists that were never acknowledged. They even have Esley Riddle on the stage with them. The Carter family, you know, played with him for a long time, but they didn't acknowledge this. So what I love is that we've come to a day where we do.
Yeah.
And that and that Beyonce is actually making so much money, because one thing I do remind, music is a business. So basically they were selling race. It's not the art, it is a business. And what is going to help this in the capitalist society is people realizing, oh my goodness, we can make some more money.
Yeah.
And that the market and this part is going to be a powerful force. And that black people actually listen to country. We have very good data on that right now, that the percentage of black people that listen on a weekly and a monthly basis to country. And people are thinking, I want that audience too. I want just a little bit of the Beyonce money. And so it is odd that this actually, that we're not getting the evolution because of justice or equity, but we're getting it because it's going to be a market correction.
Yeah. Well, that was always a part of the civil rights movement, the economic.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it's interesting because not as many people listen to radio, but radio is still quite segregated. However, you have someone like Beyonce coming along and her songs are played on country stations now after a fight, and also R&B stations. Then you have the re-recording of Tracy Chapman's song by Luke Combs and that was originally what folk alternative, and now that's on country. So it seems like things might be breaking down, and also the way people are getting their music is different. So, yeah.
I was just gonna say, and one reason why that song was initially, I mean, even the way that artists are categorized even, and this is why I think it's so great that, in your book, you're going to these artists who maybe their records came out as R&B records or something before, and you're saying, this is part of my Black country canon.
A Tina Turner,
Right.
Bush City Limits.
And one of the points I think that comes through there is that the reason why these artists are marketed in the way they're marketed has to do with what they look like rather than what their music sounds like in a lot of cases, right?
Or thematically, that I'm looking at that, let's look at the actual content
Yeah.
and determine what the music is. I think, since I gave that weird example of the economics, I have to say how there are equity and justice things that in the art, that a very racist video, and I would just say I think this is a racist video. It was for a song called Try This in a Small Town. And it was a really racist video that actually put forward, it valorized a place where Black people were lynched. It was a really wild thing. But that same summer, there became an issue of a Black man who was attacked by some drunken people in Montgomery, Alabama. And a young man jumped off a boat to swim, to support, to defend this older Black man who was just doing his job, a boat captain. And one of the wild things that happened is that this song, Try This in a Small Town, became all through TikTok. Black people made these little films of what became known as this Alabama sweet tea event. And I said, there's nothing countrier than swimming to the fight in defense of an elder. And I think it was in a small town. What I do love about small town America, my friends, there's a man called Bobby Braddock, and Bobby Braddock has had so many number ones. He wrote He Stopped Loving Her Today, Divorce. He's in the Country Music Hall of Fame. Bobby Braddock comes from a small town Southern country experience. He never denied that racism was real on Music Row, and he stood by me as an ally. In a small town, you know who the fair people are and who the bigoted people are. You know who they are in your own families. And so I love that Try This in a Small Town, and people knew they were being unfair to that man, and they defended it. And I like the fact that the art can be more than its politics at times. And that was a way that the people sourced some deeper meaning to that song.
That's right. So at this time, we're going to take some questions from the audience, but I want to thank the panelists.
Thank you.
Okay. Here's something we didn't talk about. Why does country music include a lot of references to food? Is this a Black thing?
Well, I have a quick answer to that. I teach a course called Soul Food in Tex Aztecs, because the two things Southerners are most proud of are food and our music. And that there's a lot of country, and it's also where the transcendence of that whole heaven, remember I said evangelical Christianity, that if you didn't get justice on earth where you got it, on a cloud in heaven when you were eating milk and honey and telling Jesus how you did me. So that this, I think that that's why there is so much, there is a lot of food in country.
Okay. Why did a lot of Black country singers perform overseas in the 1970s and 80s? Is this a thing?
They still do now. Reese Palmer, they can make more money. That in Europe and across around the world, there has been much more acceptance of Black country artists. And also certain white country art. Don Williams is really popular, but even right now, a lot of the Black country artists have to go to Europe to make their money.
Yeah, and that's really, it's been that way for Black musicians in a lot of traditions, for decades. There's a kind of a long tradition of European audiences recognizing the value of Black music in terms of the musicians getting paid more, in terms of the musicians being treated with dignity, that they would not, they wouldn't get that type of treatment in America, And so yeah, it's not to say that there's not racism in Europe, but it is to say that there's a very different perspective on African American art from a lot of European audiences that you've seen for quite a long time.
And that goes back to the Bohies brothers. I see Laura Rosberg from Canada. They were these brilliant Black Canadian banjo players in the 19th century, ended up going and performing a lot in Europe, in England, and for royalty and giving lessons. And their banjo duets and their dueling banjos is the precursor for the dueling banjos that you all know from Deliverance and other ones, but they found their success in Europe.
And the Fisk Jubilee Singers, too. Another 19th century example from Nashville, yeah.
How much more time do we have? Okay, so there are a couple of questions that relate to hip hop. And hip hop artists like Lil Nas X and Shabuzi integrating country. Talk about that relationship. And I know you said something yesterday when we were talking about hip hop also being a similar form.
I actually think there's a lot of connection between hip hop and country because of the narrative storytelling. That hip hop songs tell stories, tell complicated stories. So do country songs. There's always, and they're not just, pop songs, Motown songs often can be very abstract and are about feelings. And I think that these are all valid, that they're not literal narrative storytelling forms. And there's so many differences because hip hop is so much depends on rhythm and time, which country doesn't, and can be much more musically complex. But where they both are very complex is in the storytelling.
I think also a point in hip hop history where maybe that kind of convergence between the two, like where you can see some of that, or at least hints of that, when you have the rise of Southern hip hop, you have hip hop artists who are talking about like a Black rural experience. In some cases, talking about really the same types of experiences and environments and things that you might hear in a country song, right? And there's, maybe an opening there for, the type of actual crossing over into another genre that we see later on, or like an explicit fusion of hip hop and country. And, and then also you've had a hip hop influence on country music for a long time, which was kind of like at the root of the controversy around Lil Nas X, of course, was that when you have a hip hop country fusion artist who is Black, they do not get recognized as country. Meanwhile, you've had white artists incorporating hip hop into their music for a long time without their identity as a country musician being challenged. So there was, that was a moment that I think really highlighted some of the, the reason for these divisions, right?
And the Lil Nas X thing is important to note the importance of education and museums and reading. A lot of people honestly said, our culture is not your costume. They wrongly said it, but they honestly said it because they didn't know that 20% of cowboys were Black, minimum of 20%. They actually didn't know that. It had been erased from their knowledge base. And so they think that it is some kind of appropriation of their culture as opposed to continuation. And they're not familiar with the Black eccentrics of country that Lil Nas X was building on. He was as much building on Swamp Dogg and Stoney Edwards and the Wooten Brothers. Who?
Oh, Cassie.
Cassie Gardner. Yes, I love him. My Cassie Gardner, the organist.
That was the one.
Who Greg Allman was building on, that people don't, that he owed to. So these Black Southern eccentrics, and which connects to the global Black dandy. There's the plantation dandy that denigrates Black people, but there is the intellectual Black dandy that is a resolution of opposites, very similar to what some of the 18th century French dandies were doing. So, but people aren't aware of all that.
So, I have to mention this since we have a couple more minutes. Today is Prince's birthday.
And show them your earrings. Show them your earrings, baby.
These were bought in Detroit, by the way. But you mentioned the one little line in your book that you say Prince.
I love Prince.
Came close.
He mentored Reese Palmer for about 3 years. He really worked hard. And interesting, this is great allyship that the student, Mac, a student of mine who came out of privilege from East Tennessee, at least one parent had gone to Harvard. He got into my course on Black country, and he ended up writing his whole thesis on Reese Palmer. And I knew Reese Palmer. We bought her archives at Vanderbilt, and she had never told me until Mac Hunt interviewed her for days and days and days. she had never revealed and then documented that work with Prince, because she had been essentially heartbroken about it. At one point, he broke with her because he thought she was getting into an abusive relationship with the manager, which she was. He was right about that. But he did work with her, and Prince, actually, my favorite Prince song is Kiss. And that's the one in which he samples a country song. Brenda Lee is sampled in that song. And it's just absolutely wild. And I will say that the one thing I regret that I did in my history in country and Western music is that I sort of broke into Quincy Jones's house. You can read about that. I don't believe it.
Great story. Do we have time for that one?
I don't have time for it, but I will tell you. But when I did, I was wearing banjo earrings, and they had been cooked in a little toaster oven by my friend Heidi Hyatt, who was married to Walter Hyatt.
Yeah.
And one of the songs in the album that I co-wrote is with the great Walter Hyatt, Get the Hell Out of Dodge. And Lyle Lovett always said that Walter was his very favorite country artist of all time. Walter died. But his wife, Heidi, who now is widow, baked me little banjo earrings. And when I broke into Quincy Jones' house, I was wearing them. And she just made me another pair, so that's another good ally.
Oh, I need to be her. Okay, well, that wraps up our questions.
Right.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you all again for coming. We'd like to invite you all to a book signing of Alice's memoir, My Black Country, which will be in Heritage Hall upstairs. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great weekend.